Let's be real. What just happened in the WNBA isn't a storyline about basketball. It's a case study in how a league can fail its biggest star at the exact moment she made it relevant again. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another rookie. She was the lightning bolt that brought a once struggling brand back to life. Every ticket sold, every headline written, every clip that went viral pointed to one thing. The WNBA finally had its face. But then, the same league that profited off her rise watched in silence as she got battered, elbowed, and dragged through games that looked more like brawls than basketball. The referees swallowed their whistles. Commentators tiptoed around the obvious, and executives acted like protecting their golden goose might somehow make them look biased. What they didn't realize is that their fear of appearing unfair ended up exposing something far worse, a system completely unprepared for real success. Because when your biggest star gets targeted and your officials do nothing, that's not a physical game. That's a protection crisis. And the WNBA just proved it has one. Before Caitlin Clark ever stepped onto a WNBA court, the Indiana Fever were an afterthought. Empty seats, quiet crowds, and local covers that barely registered beyond the box score. They averaged around 3,000 fans a night. Numbers more fitting for a college scrimmage than a professional franchise. But then, Clark arrived, and everything changed overnight. The moment she laced up in that Fever jersey, arenas across the country transformed into sold-out events. Suddenly, 17,000 fans were packing venues to watch her play. Not just at home, but everywhere she went. The Fever became the league's hottest ticket, leading the WNBA in attendance both home and away. That wasn't coincidence. That was the Caitlin Clark effect. Her impact didn't stop at the turnstiles. Jersey sales broke records no one thought were touchable. Clark's name shot past legends like Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird, players who spent decades building their legacy. And she did it all in one rookie season. ESPN couldn't stop running her highlights. Social media turned every step-back three into a viral moment. She wasn't just selling tickets. She was selling the idea that the WNBA can finally matter to the casual sports fan. Clark's arrival sparked something the league had been chasing for years: mainstream attention. Fathers brought daughters to games. Kids wore her number in the stands. Even fans who never watched a women's basketball game in their life suddenly had a reason to tune in. The Fever went from a forgotten team to a national story because of one player's presence. That's how massive her influence was. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because the same player who reignited the league's pulse would soon become the one left unprotected. And the league's silence on what came next said more about his priorities than any press release ever could. It didn't take long for fans to notice that something was off. Every game Caitlin Clark played seemed to come with a little extra. A harder foul here or an unnecessary shove there. It wasn't just physical basketball anymore. It felt personal. Opponents weren't just trying to beat her. They were trying to send a message. And the league, for reasons no one could quite explain, seemed fine letting it happen. The moment that truly exposed it came during that now infamous game when Clark took a blindside hit. A blatant, body-first shove that sent her sprawling to the floor. Fans were stunned. Commentators hesitated, and the referees, they just let play continue. No flagrant foul, no review, nothing. The silence after that play said everything. It wasn't just about one cheap shot. It was about what the league was willing to tolerate when it involved their biggest star. From that point forward, Clark had a target on her back. Players who'd been in the league for years treated her like she hadn't earned a spot, like her fame made her fair game. She became the face of a new kind of hostility, one rooted in resentment, jealousy, and the belief that she hadn't quote-unquote paid her dues. Some players even admitted it publicly, calling her hype overblown or saying she needed to be humbled. It was an unspoken rule: make her uncomfortable, make her earn it. But that mindset came at a cost, because every time Clark got knocked down without a whistle, the league's credibility took another hit. Viewers weren't blind. They saw the replays, the hits, the smirks that followed. And while Clark handled it with her trademark composure, fans began to ask the one question the WNBA seemed afraid to answer. Why was the league allowing its biggest draw to be treated like a punching bag? The truth is, protecting a star player isn't favoritism. It's smart business. The NBA learned that decades ago with Jordan, LeBron, and Curry. The WNBA, though, seemed determined to learn it the hard way. And soon that failure would turn from a controversy into a full-blown crisis. Behind closed doors, league officials were facing a dilemma they didn't know how to handle. Caitlin Clark has single-handedly injected millions of dollars in revenue, boosted viewership to record levels, and turned the WNBA into a talking point across mainstream media. But with that fame came a new kind of pressure, one the league wasn't prepared for. Every time Clark got fouled hard or tangled with a veteran, the question wasn't just, was it a foul? It was, is the league protecting her? And in trying to avoid that perception, the WNBA ended up doing the exact opposite of what made sense. Executives and referees grew overly cautious, terrified of being accused of bias. They didn't want fans or players claiming that Clark was getting superstar treatment. So instead of enforcing fairness, they let her take the hits. The message from the top was clear, even if it was never said out loud. Don't make it look like we're protecting her. But that fear turned into paralysis. Clark wasn't asking for favoritism. She was asking for fairness. And somehow the league couldn't even give her that. Meanwhile, longtime players fueled the tension with subtle jabs in interviews and social posts. They hinted that Clark hadn't quote-unquote earned her stripes, that she needed to learn the league. The WNBA, desperate to avoid internal conflict, said nothing. But silence has a way of becoming complicit. And as the league stayed quiet, the narrative started to spiral. Fans weren't seeing a fair fight anymore. They were seeing a setup.
Every elbow, every missed call, every moment Clark hit the floor without a whistle added to the perception that the league was willing to sacrifice integrity just to keep peace in the locker room. But here's the problem with playing it safe. When you refuse to stand up for what's right, you lose control of the story. And soon, the story wasn't about basketball. It was about a league too scared to protect its own future. If the league's silence was bad, the media's response was worse. Instead of calling out what was happening in plain sight, most outlets tiptoed around it, afraid to rock the boat or challenge the narrative the WNBA wanted to project. Highlight reels conveniently cut away from the worst hits. Post-game shows brushed off flagrant fouls as physical play. And the journalists who dared to speak up, they were accused of fueling division and undermining women's sports. It was as if the media decided protecting the league's image mattered more than protecting the truth. The result was a bizarre double standard. When a male star in the NBA gets hacked or targeted, analysts debated for days. But when Caitlin Clark, the biggest name in women's basketball, got slammed to the floor, the coverage was buried under tough defense headlines. Some reporters even implied she was overhyped or needed to adjust to the WNBA's style of play, as if getting blindsided was some sort of rite of passage. But behind the polished interviews and diplomatic sound bites, fans weren't buying it. Social media told a very different story. Clips of Clark being shoved, elbowed, and mocked mid-game racked up millions of views, often posted by fans frustrated with the league's and media's unwillingness to say what everyone else could see. The people were doing the journalist jobs for them, calling out what the professionals refused to acknowledge. By trying to protect the league's image, the media actually did more damage. Their silence made the WNBA look weak, dishonest, and out of touch with the fans who were actually watching. And as more people began to see the gap between what was being reported and what was really happening, public trust began to fracture. The narrative that once centered around a rising league was slowly shifting into something darker, a story about power, fear, and a golden goose the media refused to defend. But while the headlines stayed polished, the locker rooms were starting to crack, and what happened next would push the league into full-on damage control. Inside WNBA locker rooms, the tension was no longer subtle. It was visible, sharp, and growing louder by the week. Veterans who had spent years grinding for recognition suddenly found themselves in the shadow of a rookie who had become the face of the league overnight. Caitlin Clark wasn't just the new star, she was the new standard, and that didn't sit well with everyone. Players who'd once struggled to get airtime were now being asked about her in every interview. Teammates were fielding questions not about their own performances, but about what Clark said or did that night. And slowly, admiration turned into resentment. To some, Clark represented everything they never had: sponsorship deals, national commercials, and a fan base that actually cared. But instead of embracing the attention she brought to the game, a chunk of the locker room saw it as a threat. They didn't see her as a savior for women's basketball. They saw her as an outsider who'd hijacked their spotlight. That bitterness showed up on the court, in hard fouls, icy handshakes, and body language that screamed, "You don't belong here yet." It wasn't just opponents either. Even within her own team, there were whispers about how much attention Clark commanded. Some players quietly questioned why a rookie was treated like a franchise player before she'd even earned a playoff berth. Others felt the organization catered too much to her image, her media availability, her jersey promotions, her minutes. What they missed, though, was that this wasn't favoritism. It was survival. The Fever were selling out because of her, not despite her. The divide created an uncomfortable dynamic that the league refused to address. Publicly, everyone smiled for the cameras, but behind the scenes, jealousy and frustration simmered. The WNBA had finally gotten its superstar, but instead of rallying around her, much of the league turned inward, protecting ego over opportunity. And that resentment didn't just stay in the locker room. It started bleeding into the games, the media, and eventually the league office itself. What began as quiet tension was about to explode into something the WNBA couldn't control, and it would expose just how fragile the league's unity really was.
When the playoffs hit, everything that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. The Indiana Fever's first postseason run with Caitlin Clark was supposed to be a celebration, the culmination of a rookie season that reignited national interest in women's basketball. Instead, it became a slow-motion implosion that played out under the brightest lights the league had seen in years. From the opening tip, Clark was targeted like never before. Opponents didn't just guard her, they hunted her. Every possession turned into a wrestling match. Hard screens, elbows off the ball, late contact after the whistle, it was all fair game. The refs barely intervened, as if afraid to influence a game that already carried too much scrutiny. Clark kept her composure, trying to stay locked in, but the frustration was visible. She had hit a deep three to silence the crowd, only to be met with another cheap shot moments later. And each time, the cameras caught her expression, that mix of disbelief and resolve that told you she knew exactly what was happening. The Fever began to crumble under the pressure. Missed assignments, forced shots, tempers flaring on the bench. Which should have been a rallying moment turned into finger-pointing chaos. Clark's leadership, once praised for its maturity, was now being questioned. Analysts started whispering that she wasn't ready for this level, ignoring that she was being physically and mentally tested in ways few rookies ever are. But the real story wasn't just on the court. It was in how the league and media handled it. Instead of defending their biggest star during the most watched stretch of the season, the WNBA tiptoed around the controversy. Press conferences avoided the tough questions. Commentators filled the silence with generic lines about physical playoff basketball, and fans watching at home couldn't believe what they were seeing. By the time the Fever were eliminated, the narrative had flipped completely. What should have been a moment to celebrate a groundbreaking rookie season turned into an indictment of how the league treated its most valuable player. The WNBA had wanted parity. What it got instead was chaos. And after that meltdown, there was no pretending anymore. The league's fear, resentment, and silence had all caught up to it. And Caitlin Clark was left standing in the middle of the wreckage, carrying the weight of a system that didn't know how to protect her or itself. When the dust settled after the playoff collapse, the WNBA found itself staring at a harsh reality. The very thing it had been chasing for decades had slipped right through its fingers. Caitlin Clark had given the league a once-in-a-generation spotlight, sellout crowds, primetime ratings, celebrity endorsements, and a new wave of fans who actually cared. But instead of protecting and building around that momentum, the WNBA let the moment crumble under the weight of ego, silence, and politics. Sponsors who had rushed in early started to cool off. Networks that had bumped up airtime were now quietly cutting segments. The viral moments that once drove conversation turned into clips of controversy and conflict. The story had shifted from the rise of women's basketball to the league that couldn't handle success. And for a sport fighting for every inch of relevance, that shift was devastating. Fans weren't fooled either. They saw how Clark was treated. They saw the hits, the smirks, the lack of whistles. Many who had tuned in for the first time walked away disgusted, saying the league didn't deserve her. The WNBA had been gifted the rarest thing in sports, a star who could transcend the game. And instead of rallying around her, it let bitterness and fear dictate its choices. Meanwhile, Clark kept doing what she always did, showing up, staying composed, and refusing to fire back. But even her professionalism couldn't cover up the cracks anymore. The league's refusal to stand behind its own star became a symbol of something deeper, a system so insecure that it mistook success for favoritism and unity for silence. The real tragedy wasn't just the backlash or the ratings drop. It was the lost opportunity. The moment when the WNBA could have rewritten its story and proved it belonged on the biggest stage. Instead, it reminded everyone watching that it still had no idea how to handle greatness when it finally arrived. And as the off-season approached, one question echoed louder than any highlight or headline. What happens when your biggest breakthrough becomes your biggest failure? The chaos surrounding Caitlin Clark wasn't just about one player. It exposed something much deeper and more uncomfortable about the WNBA itself. For years, the league had preached unity, empowerment, and growth. But when real success finally arrived, it revealed the cracks in that message. The truth is, the WNBA's biggest problem isn't visibility, it's identity. It can't decide what kind of league it wants to be. On one hand, it wants mainstream recognition, the fans, the sponsors, the TV deals. But on the other, it clings to a culture that rejects the very spotlight it's been begging for. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring attention, she brought accountability. Suddenly, millions of new fans were watching. Fans who expected professional standards, consistent officiating, and a product worth investing in. But instead of rising to that moment, the league recoiled. It treated her fame like a threat instead of a gift. And that fear triggered a national discourse about race, gender, and the status of the league. Fans and pundits were debating why Caitlin Clark was being treated differently, whether it was part of a broader pattern of misogyny or a reflection of a league uncomfortable with its own success.
This goes beyond jealousy or physical play. It's about leadership. The WNBA's top officials, coaches, and even media partners have been reactive, not proactive. They've spent years fighting for visibility, but never built the infrastructure to handle it when it finally came. And that's why everything fell apart so quickly. No clear messaging, no consistent enforcement, no unified voice to guide the league through its biggest test. Caitlin Clark didn't create this problem, she exposed it. Her presence showed that the WNBA wasn't ready for real growth, that it had built its foundation on ideals, not systems. And when that foundation was tested, it cracked under pressure. The result wasn't just a PR disaster, it was a wake-up call. Because if the WNBA wants to survive the next era of women's sports, one driven by global attention and real business stakes, it can't afford to keep turning on its own stars. The question now isn't whether Caitlin Clark can handle the league, it's whether the league can handle Caitlin Clark, or any player who dares to take it where it's always claimed it wants to go. The WNBA stands at a crossroads, and how it moves from here will define not just its reputation, but its very survival. Caitlin Clark didn't just change the game, she forced everyone to confront what the league really is. For years, the WNBA wanted a global icon, a player who could break through the noise and make women's basketball impossible to ignore. And when it finally got her, it flinched. Instead of embracing the moment, the league hesitated, stumbled, and let the narrative spin out of control. What should have been a golden era turned into a cautionary tale, a reminder that visibility without vision can be just as dangerous as obscurity. The WNBA had everything it needed: the fans, the ratings, the energy. But it lacked one thing that separates a moment from a movement: unity. Because when your biggest star becomes your biggest controversy, it's not a player problem, it's an organizational one. Now the league faces a choice. It can either keep pretending everything's fine, brushing off criticism, silencing discussion, and hoping the spotlight moves on, or it can finally confront the truth. Protect your stars, elevate your talent, build a culture that celebrates success instead of resenting it. Because if the WNBA doesn't evolve now, it risks losing not just Caitlin Clark, but the millions of fans who came because of her. Caitlin Clark gave the WNBA something priceless: relevance. The question is whether the league is brave enough to hold on to it. The next chapter will either be remembered as the moment the WNBA grew up, or the moment it let its brightest light burn out.